There's going to be a paper identical to this going around. Why don't you just take 90 seconds and look at it and check off either with a pen or mentally anything that really speaks to you as an interest. And before we get going, I want to get an idea about what area you guys are most curious. Because this neuroscience is so vast. And my particular slant on it is to try to give you something that will give you some clinical advantage. And we'll talk a little bit about what makes a neuroscientific dimension to clinical treatment important and helpful. So just take a couple minutes and look at that as soon as you get it. Okay, so what strikes you? Is there anything, well, I call it a takeaway because I'd like you to, after this day, take away a feeling of familiarity with a lot of what's up there. Is there anything that jumps out at you that you find interesting, curious, mysterious?
I've never heard of the polyvagal
Polyvagal
system.
system, okay. Great, I'm going to be talking about it. Okay, definitely.
There's 3 brains in one.
3 brains in one. Okay, great. Anybody else? What I'm really trying to key in on the things you mentioned. Empathy, okay. A lot of what we're talking about today is going to be about empathy.
Like interpersonal neurobiology.
Okay, good. I saw another hand, yeah.
I'm interested in what you mean by the whole brain mindfulness.
Sure. Okay, 2 more.
Social engagement system goes with the relaxation response.
Okay, and that's going to go with the polyvagal nervous system. And we're going to talk about that. Yeah.
I'm interested in trauma and memory.
Great. Okay. So, we're going to cover all those. The rest is like a tickler, so you'll have, when we touch on them, you'll have just a little preset knowing that you're going to be hearing something about these items. Before I jump into talking about the brain, I want you to think about the duality of a lot of what we're going to be talking about. And by duality, what I mean is the brain is, as you probably, there's so much writing about the brain, and everything usually starts out with how complex it is. There are more neurons in the brain than there are in the Milky Way galaxy. In fact, there's more neurons in a square centimeter of the brain than there are in the Milky Way galaxy. That's how phenomenal. The brain is amazingly complex. That's one duality. But what I want you to come away with is a feeling of the simplicity and efficiency in which the brain functions. Because there are many functions that operate like a toggle switch. They are either on or off. And in terms of doing therapy, when the brain is in what I'm calling the off position, you're not going to have much success. And I'll be describing in detail what the off position is. The on position, somebody asked about the polyvagal nervous system, and that is a very recent development. Stephen Porges is a neuroscientific researcher, and he discovered, by that I mean he interpreted something that everybody knew was there, which is that the 10th cranial nerve, the polyvagal, the vagal nerve, is not just a cranial nerve, It's actually the longest nerve and nerve system in the body. It connects the brain to all of the major organs, all the major internal organs. And when it's activated, when that system is activated, there are many functions that come into place. And when those functions are in place, that's what we call the social engagement system. So I'm going to back up a second so what I just said is very clear. When you feel threatened, that system is down. When you feel relaxed and emotionally safe, that system is up. When you feel threatened, your brain sends blood to your big muscle groups. When you feel threatened, you have a fear, a flight, or fight, or freeze response. Right? That's an instinct. You don't have to think about that. And that's very well known. What's less written about, but at this point has been extensively written about, is the opposite side, which is the relaxation response. Okay, the relaxation response, we could talk about it in terms of the brain, but we can also talk about it in terms of the vagal nervous system. It's called polyvagal because it has many parts. It connects the heart, it connects the brain, it connects the face. And let me just give you an example of what happens when the polyvagal nervous system is in the on position. For one, there's a structure in the middle ear that goes from an upright position to a forward position. And in effect, what it does in the forward position is it tunes out higher and lower frequencies and leaves the middle frequencies, which are the frequencies of the human voice. Those become what you focus on. They become what you hear. So think about that. When the social engagement system's turned off, the range goes back to normal, and you're not focused on the human voice. You're focused on a lot of other things. You're focused on the perimeters. So you can see the advantage. If you're focused on the human voice, you're much more likely to pick up the nuance. When we talk about intimacy, talk about emotional intimacy, and understanding way beyond the words, but getting the texture and the tonality of what somebody's trying to get across. It's almost like a superpower that you have. We all have. But we have to be in a relaxed state. We have to feel emotional safety in order to experience that. Give you another quick example. In a fight or flight response, like I said, the big muscles get the blood, you're ready to scoot, you're ready to fight. Right? When the social engagement system comes on, the big muscle groups don't get nourished with blood. The face does, though. There are many, many muscles in the face, well over 100. You know, you become sensitized to what your face is expressing. And the reason that's so significant, and this goes back to empathy, is because when you see somebody else's face, you take a kind of bodily photo, an instant photo of what the subtlety of their musculature is. Because you've got all this extra blood, you've got all this extra sensitivity. And you read your own face, which is a mimic of the person that you're looking at. That's a neurological description of what empathy is. And that's why empathy comes from the inside. You read your own interpretation of what you see. And all this goes on unconsciously. Right? So, one reason this is interesting is it shows you how the depth of human communication, just how profound and complex it is, and how much of it goes on outside of human awareness. I mean, these things are instantaneous, right? So let's move on. Here's the obligatory amazement statements. And they still amaze me. I'm still blown away by a lot of the facts in this area. External stimuli can physically alter the brain. When I first heard about that, and I heard that there were studies and that the brains of depressed people look different, I thought to myself, for real? Is that a joke? Like it sounds like a snap when you're a little kid and you're dissing each other and say, if I looked in your brain, I would see a shriveled raisin. But actually, the frontal cortex of people who are chronically depressed shrivels. And that constriction is a pulling in. The neurons, we'll see a couple of diagrams later, but we'll see that there's this nucleus and there's an axon. The axon goes out towards another neuron. And the receiving part of that other neuron is called the dendrite. Under stress, the dendrites recede. And literally, the neurons become isolated from each other. So the networks break down. What happens when a person is depressed? Their network breaks down. They recede from their network. There's a parallelism that's very interesting. But this is a physiological response. Okay? And we're going to talk about ways to counter that. And one of the ways I'll just throw out, and I'm going to mention it again later, is exercise. Because exercise primes the brain for producing new neurons, for making new connections. So it's exercise because it's traditionally associated with when you run, let's say, the primitive man, primitive woman, when you run in the forest, there may be a reason you're running. There may be danger. You want to be alert. So you're in a state of alertness and you're ready to grasp onto whatever is significant in the situation. So you're primed genetically to release certain hormones when you're physically active. And one of those hormones is called BDNF. And it's not important what the initials are, but that is a readiness for neurogenesis. And neurogenesis is the growth of new nerve cells. Now, 25 years ago, talking about the genesis of new brain cells would have got you basically thrown out of a conference on neuroscience. It was universally believed that after adolescence, the humans were not capable of generating new brain cells. So this is part of that's a huge paradigm shift. And now, there's no question, because we have the technology to see it, that the brain generates new cells throughout the life cycle. So, people say, oh, wow, so that means like everything can be solved? Unfortunately not, because although the brain can generate the new cells, it isn't able to generate a membrane that goes around the axons and allows the cell to transmit messages super fast. So the new brain cells, the new habits, it takes work for them to be established. The old habits, the old patterns still need to be contended with. And, in particular, this is the big mystery that MS scientists, multiple sclerosis scientists are trying to solve, because that sheath that goes around the neurons, if they can figure out a way to generate it, you'll have a full recovery. Okay, research on autopsies. This is just what I was saying a minute ago. And by the way, if you have any questions as we go, please raise your hand or just call out. Wrong direction. All right, so this is just, I guess, does everybody have a feeling that the brain is in the news a lot? I mean, I do, because I look for it, But, this is interesting. This is a huge project that Obama has, about a year ago today almost. He proposed a project that would compare with the Human Genome Project, which was $3.7 billion over 10 years to study the brain. And this is an interesting thing on the bottom. Federal study indicates the Genome Project returned $800 billion to the U.S. economy. So, we're talking about developing science as if it was strictly for the love of knowledge. But these breakthroughs benefit in all kinds of ways. To me, the most exciting is that they have the potential to correct clinical conditions that up to now have been hopeless. But that's that would be the big payoff. Here's another thing. And everything I'm doing is trying to set up the nuts and bolts, and we're going to go into the nuts and bolts of some clinical cases as well. Okay? But neuroscience, and I just put this in like yesterday. I keep trying to freshen up this presentation. And I realized this, that I never thought about it before. Neuroscience is based on understanding how the neurons work, how they work. I mean, one of the big controversies that went on for about 70 years and was decided at the turn of the 20th century, like around 1900, was at the synapse points, are the neurons connected, or is there a little space in between? Because at that point, the microscopes weren't strong enough to see it. It wasn't until they invented the electron microscope that they could actually see that there was a synapse. So neuroscience is based on understanding healthy functionality. It's not based on understanding how the brain dysfunctions. It's not based on pathology. And, in the history of psychoanalysis, that's been a major criticism, that there's so much emphasis on psychopathology. Although relational psychoanalysis emphasizes something other than psychopathology, for the most part. Okay, so here's another, these are wow statements, And, part of what I'm putting this up for is just, yeah, it's impressive, they're amazing numbers. But also, when you think there are almost an infinite number of configurations to how the neural networks can connect. And when we talk about the possibility of empathy, we're talking about understanding one configuration of a neural network among millions. So the profundity, the complexity of what, if you think about what deep empathy is. You know, it takes all that extra stuff, all that extra functionality, all that the power of the social engagement system. And when we have stuff that's almost like radar, but it doesn't get used, doesn't get utilized unless there's emotional safety. And if we don't have emotional safety enough of the time, or if we develop our brains along a pattern that anticipates we won't have emotional safety, it becomes all the harder to start that system up. And, you know, we'll talk about that. I'm talking about trauma, big T trauma, but also little t trauma. Sorry, raise your hand. Yep. Okay, so this is another intriguing fact. 200,000 miles long. Do you think that's an exaggeration? I mean, does that make sense? It's true. So we're talking about scale. Now some basics. A lobe is just an area, and you know, when you're starting out talking about the brain, one of the things that can be very off-putting is all the Latin. You know, like why don't they just call it front part, right? But we don't have a choice about that. So the frontal lobe is very key. Anybody, before I talk about it, does anybody have a sense of what the frontal lobe does?
Regulates emotions.
Okay, good. Yeah, great. Oh. Speech. The frontal lobe and actually the temporal lobe is speech. This is a speech center, and this is a speech center, but you're still absolutely right, because what the frontal lobe does is allows you to think about what you're saying, right? And it allows you to formulate and order the ideas behind what you're saying, right? But speech also has a lot of motor aspects, right? And even visual, if you kind of imagining that you see what you say, or imagine a word when you're reading. So and everything actually involves a coordination of different things. But the frontal lobe is where you think about what you're thinking. It's where decision making happens. And it's about what happens with your attention, and whether you have control of your attention or you don't. So when we talk about, there's a book called In the Realm of the Hungry Ghosts by a guy named Gabor Mate, and he talks. He's an MD psychiatrist who works with drug addicts in Vancouver, and he talks about damage to the frontal cortex and how they're kind of like there's a double injury, because there's a tendency towards impulsivity anyway, and then the whole mechanism that would allow you to evaluate whether your decision is impulsive or not is essentially damaged, you know, and physically damaged. So it becomes very hard. Frontal lobe, we'll talk a lot about that. I just also want to say, there are many different psychopathic conditions: clinical depression, clinical anxiety, schizophrenia, eating disorders, and so on, that are described under the heading of hypofrontality. So underactive frontal lobe. Frontal lobe isn't doing what it should be doing, so it's not in charge of anything. And it can't slow down the emotionality or impulsivity. Right? Yeah?
Is the frontal lobe in children less active, or
Absolutely. Absolutely. Great point. Great point. Because I left out one thing from my list. And I left out a lot of things, but I left out one big thing that I intentionally mean to talk about, which is teenagers. The frontal lobe completes its development at about age 23. Teenage kids for sure, but teenagers also, they don't have the full equipment they need in order to reason out what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. When I was working with a suicidal, drug-addicted teenager this is about a dozen years ago, and he was going to, with a couple of friends, he was going for a weekend to study for his SATs. And so I asked him a little about his methodology. He said, well, when we get there, we're going to drop acid. So I said, really? Okay. I mean, he almost made me want to close up shop. You know. Because not only, I'm just a sidebar, not only did I have this information, but what am I going to do with it? He gave it to me confidentiality, and I'm so happy he's telling me what's really going on, but, you know, there's a dilemma. Had a happy ending, but there's a dilemma. Okay, so I'm spending a lot of time on the frontal lobe, because for our purposes, as therapists, we want to strengthen a client's ability to connect with the frontal lobe. This is like Freud's, the observing portion of the ego, right? This is the reflective capacity. This is the ability to see you're off when you are off. It's the ability to know you're on when you are doing what is in your best interest. It's coming out of the frontal lobe. The parietal lobe is, it has a lot to do with movement. It has a lot to do with math. Complex reasoning. The temporal lobe, hearing and speech. The occipital lobe is vision. And the cerebellum is movement. So let me talk about the cerebellum for a couple of minutes. And everything I'm talking about to you is actually something that has, when I read about it, I said, wow, that's interesting, right? People thought the cerebellum, that's all about lower functioning. That's not very cerebral, right? Yet, in order to organize your thoughts, you've got to move them around in relation to each other. And there were experiments in higher cognitive functioning that, to the surprise of the people involved, it was noted that the cerebellum was linked to and lit up when higher functioning was happening. And one of the people, I'll just throw out a name, Antonio Damasio, has written a lot about this kind of thing. And he's somebody you know, if you like this area, he's somebody you want to read. And he's also very readable. He doesn't read like a scientist with a lot of jargon. He reads, it's like stories, narratives. But so this is an interesting thing, the primacy of movement. And to give you another example, there's a sea slug that's been widely studied because it's a very simple organism. The sea slug has a brain, and it navigates around, and then it plants itself on a rock, and it stays there the rest of its life. First thing it does when it plants itself is it devours its own brain for nutrients. So it's a nice metaphor for, if you're not going to move at all, you don't need a brain. You know? the big split. We talk about brain organization. This is usually what people think about. Left, right. Right? So left is analytical. There's a lot of L's. Some people make a list of the L's. Logical, linear, making lists, analyzing, and the right brain is generally thought of as the more artistic, like grasping things in their wholeness, epiphanies. Einstein was thought to have a very highly developed parietal lobe, which is where math cognition is thought to be centered. But he also had these thought experiments where he imagined himself famously like riding on a light beam, right? And he from that vantage point figured out something that led to theory of relativity. And he had a lot of thought experiments like that. So that's the right brain. Now there's a guy named Daniel Tammet who is, he calls himself an autistic savant. He is English. He was very different as a child, you could say. Kind of had a lot of special treatment as a child. When he emerged in his full functionality, he has certain abilities, like he can learn any language within 6 days. He demonstrated that with,
yeah.
Right, you've heard about this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Icelandic, right?
Yes,
That's
yes.
crazy.
And Icelandic is an extremely difficult language, and he was fluent in it. You could joke in it, you could get double entendres in it after 6 days. He also memorized pi to the place where, and this is with full accuracy, no errors, he recited pi for 8.5 hours straight. He has the world record. Okay. He also is a poet. He's gay. He has a relationship that is seemingly warm and loving. Okay, so we're talking neuroscience. He came up with a theory about how and why he has these special powers. That's to try and experiment with and understand. And the theory is that there is, within the brain, the center of the brain, there's a corpus callosum. It connects the left and right hemispheres. It's the most dense part of the brain in everybody's brain structure. His theory is that his corpus callosum is twice as dense. So information he has on both sides gets extrapolated out, exponentially. And that's why, and so he can do, the computations he can do are amazing. I mean, he's faster than most computers. And he sees numbers as colors, and he sees large numbers as shapes, and he fits puzzle pieces together. And it sounds crazy, right? It sounds like, does that make any sense at all? But there's a neurological idiosyncrasy that lies behind what he's doing. People think something like that is unexplainable. It's just hard to understand, but it can be understood. So this is that. Here's the left list. There's the right list. By the way, you're going to get this PowerPoint, so you'll have that. I think it's going to go up on YouTube. And this is, somebody asked about the 3-in-1 brain. So this goes back to, in the beginning, I prefaced by saying we're going to talk about a lot of dualities, like when the mind-body is feeling safe, when it's feeling unsafe, that's a duality. when the left brain is more dominant as compared to the right brain. That's another duality. This is a three-way split. That's very important to grasp. And again, we can talk about the brain as being infinitely complex and difficult to understand, but there are certain ways in which it's quite simple. And those are generally the most important ways for us to understand if we're going to use the information clinically. So I want to talk for a minute, before I talk about the three-part brain, about how and why you would use the information clinically. Okay? Anybody want to open it up? Anybody have any ideas? But why would a knowledge of neuroscience help you when you're talking to somebody who's depressed or drug addicted? And the answer is, the answer is very, it's hard when somebody asks you for an answer, you feel put on the spot, but it's something that's very commonsensical that, that you, I think, will feel very comfortable with. It's just another way to depathologize a person's understanding about who they are and what's going on in them. It's a way to help them interpret what they're doing without blaming themselves or becoming infuriated that they are the way they are. The way they are makes sense. And you can give them a template that they can understand. So first of all, you're going to put them on a road to having more realistic expectations about what they can or cannot do. You're working with a drug addict and you're working on building up their willpower. You're going down the wrong road. Their willpower is very much damaged. They need a lot of external support. So you don't want to... Willpower is fine if you can develop it, but that's not going to save them. And there's something about psychological strength or psychological capacity that we tend to, if we were to make a comparison with physical strength and physical capacity, we would never say to somebody who comes in our office feeling very weak, you'd feel much better about yourself if tomorrow morning you picked up a 200-pound barbell and walked up and down the stairs in your building. Silly, right? Wouldn't say that. But if you're saying to a drug addict, can you do everything you can to try to refrain this week? Remember why it's not good for you. It's not enough. It's asking them to pick up a 200-pound barbell. Right? If somebody has an anger management problem, and you say to them, if you can identify that you're angry, once you identify you're angry, try to talk more directly to your partner about what you feel. Try to get back to reasoning about what's really bothering you. That's not good advice. They've got to calm down first before they can do anything. They've got to know that there's a period of time that they'll need. Right, I was working with a couple just the other day. They were sitting at a cafe having a very nice time talking about how they were going to deal with the child that was having difficulties in their family. It's a stepmother situation she's the new one in to the family. And the father, her husband, said something that indicated he knew how difficult his daughter was, but he didn't want to say that there was something wrong with her. And his wife was saying, it was a subtle kind of conversation. These are very self-aware people. And she's saying, well, I'm not saying there's something wrong with her, but don't you think it's a little not normal, the way she responded? The way she lost her temper? And he wouldn't give her that. He wouldn't say she's not normal. Okay? So she said, you're defensive and you choose your daughter over me every time. So their nice experience broke down. They walked out of the cafe, they're walking down the street, and he's trying to say to her, listen to what I'm saying. I'm not choosing her over you. She says, I don't want to hear about it. Don't talk to me about this now. He says, look, I'm your husband and you've got to listen to me. Right? He's not, what he's doing doesn't make any sense. Her state of mind is invisible to him. She is not capable of listening at that moment. Right? So a lot of what I would love to think I'm going to impart to you today has to do with the timing of these interactions. And we're going to take it into, there's a guy who we'll talk about in a little while. His name is Jaak, J-A-A-K, Panksepp. He was born in Eastern Europe, but he lived most of his life in the United States. He's an effective neuroscientist, did a lot of animal research starting in the 50s. So he's like a dean of this kind of research. And what he talks about is, like I've described the social engagement network. He talks about, he has a different schema. And the particulars of it aren't important. It's the idea, the basic idea that's important here. And the idea is that there are 7 different neural networks. And when a person is in 5 of those networks, they're essentially not available for intimate, interpersonal conversation. So you need to work around until both parties are calm enough to have a meeting of the minds. You know? So just in terms, and it's not easy, but that's the blueprint. And if you have questions about that, I want to talk about it more. Okay, and we'll come back to it more. Yeah.
I was just going to ask you to find what they are.
I've got a slide. We'll go over that whole thing. Yeah. Okay, so I promise you I'm going to try and bring these two are the same. It's a different graphic for the same thing. And the 3 think like an evolutionary biologist about how the brain developed. First, the reptilian brain developed. And reptiles were here before mammals, right? So the reptilian brain involved regulation of the critical functions for sustaining life. And they're all unconscious. Heartbeat, oxidation processes, all that. Right? Primitive brain. Middle brain is, and you're going to hear this word a lot. I haven't used it that much today. Probably will use it a lot more. But in general, in the literature, the limbic system, limbic is a big keyword. And the limbic system is, a lot of people refer to it as the emotional brain or the middle brain. Now, it's also referred to as the mammalian brain. And what that refers to is like mammalian as in tiger. The tiger brain doesn't have upper cognitive functions the way we do. It's primarily functions out of that, what is our middle brain. That's very highly developed. So fight, flight, awareness, keen awareness of surroundings, ability to pounce at any moment. That's the middle brain. It's the limbic system. It's the tiger brain. The higher function is referred to as the neo-mammalian, the new mammalian. And although the dolphin and the gorilla and the monkeys have brains that in some way are comparable to ours, they don't have a lot of the more advanced features that we do. particularly their social engagement system doesn't involve what ours does. And there's just it's like in any aspect, and there are thousands of aspects, there's a little add-on. It's like an operating system, and then we've gone 2 or 3 levels beyond their operating system. We've extrapolated out. So the tiger had a brain that didn't include the neocortex. Now, the human brain is 80% neocortex. I mean, the human brain is a phenomenal growth development. And what is it reaching towards? Because a lot of it has to do with having the ability to cooperate, which involves the ability to be aware of what other people are doing and how you fit in with what other people are doing.
That kind of reminds me how, like, in all the alien movies, they have, like, huge cerebral cortexes, and they're all able to, like, telepathy with each other, and, like, that's how they communicate.
Yeah, and you can see what I was talking about with the social engagement system. It's like we're reading the musculature of another face, and we're flashing that musculature on our face and reading that. It's pretty intense. So here's another, this may be a little clearer, but it's the same concept. Now what I was saying was, and this is, let's see if this works. Whoops. No, I didn't mean that one. This is what I mean. Now, I was saying the reptilian brain includes a cerebellum, which has to do with leadership, right? So a lot of people are thinking, if a brain function is a higher cortical function, what does it have to do with this? But what we're learning is it has a lot to do with this. There's integration that goes right to left, and there's integration that goes vertically, up and down. Right? And you can see it's just a common sense kind of thing that this is called the lower, this is the brainstem, and this is the lower brain, this is the middle brain. It's just, it's the way it is when you're standing up. Right? And that's the higher. It's the uppermost. And it's the outermost. And the outermost of the neomammalian is this is the front of the frontal. Right? The cream of the cream. Front of the frontal. Orbitofrontal. Orbit means eyes. The orbits. Yeah. In most cases, I'm not really familiar with that case, I don't. But if we're talking about brain dead, it means, whoops, okay. Brain dead means this part is working, so the heart is beating, but the rest of it is not. Right? So it also could mean that the connection, it could mean that the other parts of the brain are functional but disconnected. Right? It's like the cable is snapped. So you're only getting one function, like the TV goes on, but you can't get the channels. That's usually what brain dead means.
What's that bump?
That's the beginning of the spinal cord. And it's an exaggeration. It's not in scale. Except maybe some dinosaurs look like that. Yeah?
Is there any sort of left and right side to this part?
Well, it's a good question. This is a side view, right? So presumably, this person, their friend is there, so you're seeing the left side. You're looking at the left side. If you could flip it around, you'd see the right side. But this isn't a diagram of left-right.
Is there sort of different parts of the reptilian part of the brain?
Oh, I don't know much about that. It's a great question. I've never read about that or heard about that. There would have to be, because, generally speaking, the left part of the body is controlled by the right part of the brain. So they may have a very modified cortex that's strictly based on responding to the need to move parts of the body. Not to think about moving parts of the body, but to actually move them. They probably do, and that's probably how it works. Great question. Okay, here is another very important clinical concept. And the person I associate most closely with this concept is Daniel Siegel. And he's written about 5 books. The most recent one is called Brainstorm, and it's about the adolescent brain. And my favorite of his books is called Mind Sight. And it involves the ability of people to see into other people's minds. But it's not about mysticism. It's about neuroscience. So the low road this is another important duality. We're talking about the low road and the high road. The low road happens when you perceive something and it comes in, the thalamus is near the middle of the brain. It's considered part of the midbrain. It's near the limbic system and part of the cortical system as well. But the thalamus is kind of a way station. So something comes in, it goes to the thalamus, and then it either goes to the amygdala or up to the cortex. If it goes straight, if it's perceived as being possibly dangerous, it'll go to the amygdala. And if the amygdala kind of verifies that this could be danger, the amygdala sounds the alarm. The amygdala it has 2 parts, there's a left and a right, and it's about the size of an almond. And some people call it the brain within the brain, and it controls the fight or flight response. Okay, so there's the word amygdala and limbic system. Those are good neuroscience basic words. So if this is a classic example, I've read it in many books about neuroscience. You're in the forest and you see something on the floor about 25 feet away. You're not sure if it's a stick or a snake. Okay? And let's say you're with somebody. And there's a differential in your reactions. One of you thinks it is a snake, one of you thinks it is a stick. The one who thinks it's a snake will be triggered. The fight or flight reaction will be in full bloom, right? Which means the heart rate will go up. The palms might start sweating, right? There's a whole, just like I was saying in the social engagement system, there's a whole complex set of reactions. With the fight or flight, there's a whole set of complex reactions. The thing has been interpreted as a threat. Okay? So, and it goes, there's no time. If you already have stamped it as a threat, the reaction is instantaneous. And you don't reconsider either. Because what does reconsidering involve? It means thinking about your thought, thinking about your feeling. That's a frontal cortex function. The low road bypasses the frontal cortex. So think about it in a relationship. The guy that I was talking about in the cafe says, yeah, I agree with you. My daughter, she certainly overreacts. I don't know if I'm comfortable saying she's not normal, but I'm with you. She's hard to deal with, right? His partner takes that as a threat. That's a threat to her security. It's a subjective judgment. and she becomes activated. Right? Okay. The other person sees the shape and is reasonably certain it's not a snake. It's probably a twig. That functionality, first of all, we're talking about, like a portion of a second in difference. But in neural functioning and in actual emergency situations, that can mean the difference between life and death. Let's say something is falling on your head, and you never are aware of it, but somehow you jerk back, right? It misses you. You don't even know, you never saw it, but you had that reaction. Well, of course you did see it, you just never entered consciousness, right? And it went through the low road, right? Fight or flight, emergency. The other way takes more time, but gives you a shot at thinking about what you want to do. Now, when you talk about this, it sometimes feels like you're trying to get everybody to go the high road. This is, the low road is a lifesaver. This isn't like, one is good and one is bad. It's just different functionality. But the thing is, when people become habituated to going the low road, and they make assumptions and are hypervigilant, thinking that whatever gets said next is going to be a danger sign, then there's something that, then they become closed off to the possibility that they may see something they didn't expect to see. Right? So lots of couples come in for couples work in just that position. Go ahead.
So what does this have to do with you were saying that Dana Siegel wrote a book that was about people being able to sort of read each other without speaking?
Well, it's not so much without speaking. It's the kind of thing I was talking about, that empathy loop, that empathy resonance, that instantaneous recognition of what's going on inside the other person. Right? That's what I mean by mind sight.
And that falls under the category of the low road.
No, actually, that doesn't fall into the category of the low road, because no matter what happens, the brain processes, generally speaking, at an incredibly impressive rate. Right? So all these processes are happening quickly. Right? If you can tell me what color something is, that's not the low road, but you could do that in a flash, right? Right? So this is just, he talks about these kind of processes, and he, as far as I know, invented this language. This is his language, low road and high road. And he's a great lecturer, and he's on YouTube. So if you're interested in hearing him speak, he's really good. But that's a good point. It's everything is relative. The high road is not slow in many respects, but it won't get you out of the way of a falling brick. If you're going to think about, is that brick going to hit me? It's too late.
Can I just ask a question of
Sure.
So those thalamus, and then we can go to the amygdala or the cortex. So the amygdala is where the low road.
Yeah, that is the low road. In other words, otherwise it would come back to the amygdala, but after it's gone through the cortical stuff. In other words, if it comes into the insula and circulates around the cortex and goes, it will connect with the amygdala. But yeah. And there's another link that also it goes through that's very important, which is the hippocampus. And we'll talk about that. And the hippocampus has to do with memory and creating instantaneous memory, short-term memory, long-term memory, and consciousness. So, the low road, you sometimes are not even conscious of what's going on. Right? Any other questions? Okay, so road rage and low road. right? You know, people are absolutely certain that the guy was trying to kill them, you know, by not putting the signal on, or by putting the signal on too late, or whatever it is. So the low road is about impulse versus reflection. And a lot of what we're talking about when we want to sensitize ourselves or our clients to high road, low road is their habitual default processing. You know, and a lot of what we think about as mindfulness has to do with getting off the low road as the default, and getting off automatic pilot in terms of response, responding without thinking. You know, there's lots of things we need to do automatically without thinking a lot about it. You know, you don't want to ponder about whether it's a good idea to turn on the cold water fountain if you want to drink the water, right? If we had to think about everything we do, we'd be lost. But when it comes to interpersonal relationships, and when it comes to things like understanding that it's possible that something may sound like an experience you've had before, but because it's with a different person, it might have a different meaning. Right? To be open to that possibility. Or even, to give you a different example, if a couple has been very sarcastic with each other, and they start to realize that that's really hurting them, like they thought it's part of the way we joke around, but actually they were cutting each other up a lot by saying things that really did get under each other's skin. So they may try to slow that thing down, but they're also likely to misinterpret something that could have been intended as a benign joke, and they're looking for the deeper dig inside of it. Like, in other words, they're interpreting a smile as a smirk, right? Like, I'm happy for you, and they're thinking that's sarcastic. You know what I mean? It's like retraining your responses. Now, I started to say this, but I didn't complete it. And this is one of the reasons that I started getting interested in neuroscience. Because originally it was the furthest thing from my mind. I didn't start out with a huge fascination with neuroscience. But I was working with a guy who was a Wall Street guy who was a cocaine addict. And just so happens he made decent money, but he didn't know why he was on Wall Street. It was just something he fell into. And he didn't like it, but he was continuing with it. As an undergraduate, his father had been a doctor, and he studied science and he loved science. So I'm talking about the physiological consequences of cocaine on the brain. And all of a sudden he's listening in a whole different way. He's engaged. He says to himself, I'm thinking, this isn't the usual therapy bullshit. He's talking about my actual brain and stuff that's happening in my brain and how it affects the way I think. This is real. There's tremendous prejudice in the culture in favor of scientific descriptions of psychological occurrences. If you can describe something in evidence-based terms, a lot of people will listen in a different way. So neuroscience becomes a tool for communicating that you're serious about understanding who the other person is. It's not useful for everybody, but a lot of people respond to it. And because it's become popular, a lot of people expect you to know some of the basics. I mean, I've had patients use the word amygdala to me, with me. bring it up themselves. You know, I see cartoons about it. Like, excuse me, I was just dysregulated. You know. Okay, the high road. Let's talk a little bit about the development of the brain. And this is a very interesting thing, and it tells you a lot about why the low road is foundational, why it's the default mode for a lot of people. Because, for one, the cortex is very much unformed at birth, but the low road is set up. And the high road, which involves the upper neocortex, like I said before, it's not complete until the mid-20s. You know?
Wait, hey, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
You said that a couple times now. I just want, I've also heard that
Yeah.
said a lot that, until someone's 23, their brain isn't fully developed.
Right.
But it also seems like there's a whole cultural and contextual element to it, right? Like if you're put in a position where you need to grow up, you grow up. Like, does that mean that? I know you talked about like neurologically what's happening in the brain. There are all kinds of 23-year-olds that are like holding down very complex lives and lifestyles.
Oh, yeah. Well, you can be intellectually incredibly mature at 12. You can graduate from Harvard at 14. I mean, it's been done. But this involves a complex coordination of emotion and thinking. And there are certain kind of skills like math and music that are famously come in early. You can understand systems, you can understand technical aspects of thought processes, technical aspects. But you can't understand how it really applies to you and what your own emotional accountability is. So, like, what are the consequences of what you're doing? The idea, a 16-year-old has a very hard time thinking that if there's a 10% chance that something might be very dangerous, that they might get hurt. Like 10%? It's not going to happen to me. Just a 10% chance. That's a typical 16-year-old. 23-year-old is much more capable of saying, hey, that's 1 in 10. I could be that 1 in 10. That's what I'm talking about. Okay, so this is high road, like in terms of shopping. So it's high road, impulsivity versus reflective response. Okay, patiently listening to a friend or partner's explanation before blasting them. High road. So, it's like when you're talking to a client and you're getting this idea across, there's an implication that they can do this. This is a different, hey, and if you don't do it this way often, okay, I understand, that's been your style, but there's another style. And it may not have even occurred to you that there's another style. Because a lot of people come in and say, well, that's who I am. I get angry. I'm here, I want to be who I am. I'm angry. Okay, so a part of you is angry. But is there also another part of you that's capable of reflecting? And if you think not, how do you know? Have you ever worked with that? You're looking for people to give you a chance to talk to them about what's possible without dissing them for what they do. Right? So they feel safe because you're not disapproving, but you're not affirming either. You're joining them, but only to a certain extent. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the amygdala. And here's the This is a couple that I worked with. One of them would just get angry about everything. I won't go into the backgrounds, but they both have a lot of trauma, gay couple. The guy, Vern, I explained to him, when he gets angry, he's triggered immediately. His cortex shuts down. So without your cortex, I'm saying to him, you can't really think about what's in your best interest. You can't evaluate what's in your best interest. So you're conducting your relationship with half a brain. Does that make sense? That seemed to ring, he liked that. I mean, he got that. He wanted to be understood. That's how he felt. He felt like he was running amok. So, you know, it wasn't like, gee, that's the end of the therapy. He got that. It's over. No, it took a long time to work with it. But it's an opening. And that's an opening based on a neuroscientific insight. Because I did, you know, explain to him about the middle brain and the psychoeducation. It's, you know, to me, I basically was trained psychoanalytically at first, and then I got systems theory training and family couples theory training. But, you know, it's like, what's the moment of change? Is it when he has the realization that he could do something different? Is it conscious? Is it not conscious? I don't know, but I think the thing is that having this schema that he feels is logical and he feels is understandable gives him a sense that his behavior is controllable. And, you know, we're talking about understanding higher cognitive functioning, but we're really underneath going for behavioral change, for the, you know, in most cases. We want to see the behavior change because when the behavior changes, the thought patterns change also. And the feelings change because there's more than one set of feelings that accompany, you know, any situation. Okay, so this is, you know, couples work. The blame game. This is typical. Two people come in, each one thinks the other one is the problem. Right? And there's chronic hyperarousal if they've been together a while and they're knotted into this stuff, this power struggle. So they're both very defended. And they either they attack, defend, they attack, they retaliate, they attack, they withdraw. They're both deprived of contact because they're so preoccupied with defending themselves they can't make contact. So you're talking about reopening that. And neuroscience can help explain why it's hard to do that. So it gives them something, is like a medium to talk about why it's hard to do what they want to do. Where they're coming in, and a lot of times they're saying, we don't even know what to talk about, because whatever we talk about, it goes south immediately. Right? So I like to, in my office, I like to say that it's a blame-free zone. You know, I try to keep it that way. I try to say, with every conversation, I say, whatever we're talking about, let's see if we can convert this conversation into how do we create emotional safety out of what we're talking about. Because I want them to look for that. That's the observing portion of their ego, if you want to think about it that way. I want to enlist them in helping me. And even though I've mentioned the observing portion of the ego a couple of times, you know, I'm more, in terms of theory, thinking about attachment theory. And I'm looking for a secure attachment. A secure attachment involves emotional safety. Now, John Gottman, are you guys interested in couples work? If you could just raise your hand if you're interested. Okay. So this stuff is, a lot of what I'm saying is really, that's my main area, is couples work. Now, John Gottman, if you're not familiar with his name, he's a great one to know. He's kind of the dean of American couples therapy. And he's the first that I know of to set up a lab and do very detailed experiments. The lab was called the Love Lab. He set it up in Seattle. And he had couples with electrodes on, and they'd live in his lab for 2 or 3 days at a time. Eventually, there'd be a one-way mirror, so he could see him, they couldn't see him. And eventually, he would document frame by frame and code the interactions. So, he came up with a number of recommendations and systems. He's written about 10 books, and the one that I like the best is the first one. It's called 7 Principles of Marriage, of Successful Marriage. But they're all good. They all have something. They're not. He doesn't just repeat himself. They're interesting. He always co-writes with somebody. So I'm not going to say he's a good writer, but the books are very accessible. This is something I've talked about with lots of couples. This is only one page in the book, 7 Principles of Successful Marriage. So it's like those horsemen. And in the early book, it's only 4, the 4 horsemen. The 5th one comes later. So I'm including it. It's in a book called The Relationship Cure. But in the early one, it's just those 4. And I give them that page, and I ask them to read it and say whether it says something about their relationship. And what those horsemen are, they're modes of interacting that have been documented to describe the doom of a relationship. If you have a lot of defensiveness, if you have a lot of stonewalling, if you have a lot of criticism, a lot of contempt, the relationship is not going to go forward unless you can do something about that. So, again, it's the kind of thing where if people can see themselves in these patterns, they can do something about it. And it takes, it normalizes these patterns because they're very popular. And depending on how people respond, and some people respond and say, yeah, you're right, I really do speak to her contemptuously, or I do really speak to him contemptuously. And it's a problem. And some people will be defensive about it. So that's, which is not unusual. But it gives you a way to talk about these things that sometimes are very hard to talk about. And it's not a guaranteed way in, but it's a tool. I'm not sure if I have a slide on this or not, so I'll just say it. With his research, and there's lots and lots of research, but there's one salient finding. He worked almost, as far as I know, exclusively with heterosexual couples, so this insight is framed that way. And this is the one key finding from his research. In a relationship where a woman feels that a man is impervious to any impact her to him, that relationship is doomed. He declares that with the most certainty, more than any other finding. There's loads of findings, by the way. Does that make sense to you? Doesn't? Okay. Okay, let me repeat it again. In other words, in a relationship with a man is who he is and will not take in what his partner says and be changed in any way, that the woman eventually will become burnt out. She can't affect him at all. That's a sign of a relationship that's not going to work out. It sounds kind of radical, but it's really common sense. It's like the kind of thing like, you don't hear me, you're not listening to me. And if you don't get back something like, that's a concerned one, I want to know how I don't hear you. If you don't have anything you can work with, the relationship is essentially doomed. Because it's not much of a relationship. It's saying that there's no communication, there's no back and forth. And I'm sure this is just the way the data reads, but it's the same going the opposite direction. If it was a woman who couldn't be affected at all by what the man said, that's equally not happening. Okay, so we've got this. This is the same concept that the back door is the fast way. It bypasses that whole other route around the upper cortical functioning. And here's a picture of the amygdala, and we haven't talked about the hippocampus, and the hippocampus is really important. The hippocampus is a memory center, and it's where a perception comes in and gets shot out to the cortex to be processed. But if it's too hot and it can't be handled in the hippocampus, it goes straight to the amygdala. That's the low road. Can you think of a kind of perception or experience that would tend to go to the low road? What do you think would not be? I gave you an example of one kind, emergency, right? Emergency would not go to the high road, right? The answer is, if the perception is too stressful, it gets stamped by the secretion of stress hormone, and it registers in the amygdala as a memory that is not stored as a memory, it's stored as an experience. That's what a traumatic memory is. Two people experience the same thing. For one it's a trauma, for the other it isn't. What's the difference? The difference is the way that the memory is processed. Is it processed as a memory and coded in and categorized as something that happened? Or is it coded in as something that's stunned and in some way is still alive and waiting to be re-experienced? If it overwhelms the psyche, first of all, it kills cells in the hippocampus. Stress and trauma can kill cells in the hippocampus. And more than that, like I said, the cortisol stamps these memories in a very particular way. And the cortisol also is, since it's secreted, it has something to do with why the cells in the hippocampus get decimated. And it's the same thing that I spoke about before. Like the dendrites recede and the neurons become disconnected. And, one way to think about it or talk about it is that the cells shrivel. So the person is very depressed, the hippocampus shrivels. Alzheimer's, hippocampus shrivels. Right? When the communication gets back, it comes back. When the hippocampus revitalizes itself, because it can, that has to do with neurogenesis. That has to do with new cells replacing those dead cells. And that happens. It's interesting that process happens over a period of 3 to 6 weeks. A period of 3 to 6 weeks is exactly how long it takes for an SSRI to become effective. Paxil, any one of those drugs. Okay, so one of the thoughts is that Paxil restimulates the chemical, like serotonin, for example, doesn't in itself revitalize neurogenesis, but it causes a different hormone which inhibits the process of cell death. So that's under those conditions that cells in the hippocampus start becoming revitalized. If the hippocampus functions more normally, it means that you can contextualize what you're experiencing. So, for example, if you're terribly upset because you've just had a social experience that left you feeling humiliated and traumatized. So, from then on, you're feeling anything that reminds you of that situation makes you panic, right? But as the hippocampus revitalizes itself, you perceive these new social situations and you put them into a context and you can differentiate and say to yourself, yeah, in some way it's similar, but it's very different. This isn't a repeat. The ability to put something in context frees you from re-experiencing your association to what you're experiencing. Right? That makes sense? Yeah. So that's the beauty of the SSRIs when they work. And that's also an interesting explanation. It hasn't been absolutely proven. It's still being researched. But that's an interesting explanation for why does it take 3 to 6 weeks for them to work. Right?
You got a question?
Where? Go ahead.
So I'm understanding the neuroscience that you're presenting to us. What I'm not understanding is how we go about affecting that change.
Affecting that?
That moving a traumatic experience from the amygdala through the hippocampus so that it can be, well, if I'm understanding correctly, so that it can be processed and thought of in a different way.
Okay, great question. Great question. I have a number of slides that get to it. Okay, and what you asked is the core question of trauma treatment. Trauma theory, trauma research, new trauma techniques. Right? That's what EMDR tries to address. IFS, internal family systems, AEDP, accelerated emotional something. Right? There's an alphabet soup out there. Right? We'll talk about it. Okay, I'm just going to ask you to read this. If you have any questions, ask me. Okay, because we just talked about it. Everybody want to know about the little seahorse? Is that too fast?
No.
Okay. 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 So this is basically the the heading says it all, really. The bottom thing is interesting. Studies have shown that in trauma survivors, the hippocampus is measurably shrunken. Right? The toggle switch, this is what I wanted to talk about before, but go ahead.
If you could just go back.
Sure.
I was actually kind of wondering why some reuptake inhibitors have more epinephrine in it. If it,
Why they do?
yeah. Like for instance, like if you have like something that like prevents the reuptake of serotonin, right? So this makes you feel happier, but it also has norepinephrine in it. Wouldn't that stop the memory from forming?
I'm not really sure. It's a good question. You know, I'm much more familiar with the effects of the SSRIs, and they're much more popular and frequently prescribed. Yeah, epinephrine is an antidepressant, but it has to be tempered with something that will also slow down the process so that these cells aren't destroyed. So pure epinephrine is adrenaline, right? So, and that easily could be destructive. But it's just like caffeine is good for a headache. You know, it's like it makes things flow, but I don't think it's administered by itself. I think it's part of a cocktail. I'm really ad-libbing. I'm not sure of the answer to that. So this is a toggle switch. It's just to accentuate where we talked about the dualities. You know, that brain function, as complex as it is, often it's best understood as being something is on, and then if something else is on, what had been on is off. Like it's not like it's all on in a cacophony. You know, there's an order to the way things get turned on. If there's a fear response, the social engagement system is not on. That's a big one. Okay, so this, now I use the word fight or flight, I use the word relaxation response. Just to give a little bit more body to the relaxation response. Relaxation response, the term was coined by Herbert Benson. His book called The Relaxation Response was a huge bestseller. He's a Harvard psychologist, MD, and he's the head of the Mind Body Institute in Cambridge. He's done a lot of research with the relaxation response is a secular meditation. It's extremely simple. You sit down in a chair, relax your body, sit upright, breathe, and notice your breathing. If you want to do it fancy, you say, when you breathe out, I'm letting go of tension, and when you breathe in, I'm breathing in relaxation. That's the technique. It's, 2 paragraphs. He found with extensive research that if you do that for 20 minutes a day, you just do that. And you don't criticize yourself. You don't say, there's no right way, no wrong way to do it. You just spend the 20 minutes. That it revitalizes the health of your internal organs. It makes a noticeable difference. Okay? It's similar to meditation. It gives your body a break. It's a physiological relaxation response. And it's as profound as a fight or flight response. It's an instinct. So this is something that was revolutionary at the time. And I think we've come to accept, because of other information that's come through about mindfulness, that it makes a lot of sense and it is easy to coordinate with other findings, like, for example, the polyvagal nervous system. When you think about the polyvagal nervous system again, it's the 10th cranial nerve. It goes throughout the whole body and has connections with the brain, but also with the face and the ears and the eyes. And it works in coordination with the relaxation response. which also works in coordination with the things you do when you relax, like digest. And, I'm not sure exactly how they measure tension on the internal organs. Like, how does the liver experience tension? When you're tense, you're holding it differently. Or whatever way you hold your internal organs when you're tense, the opposite happens when you're not tense. Okay, so that's that relaxation response. And I have given this page to many clients, and I've also sat down with them and taken 20 minutes out of a session to show them the relaxation response. Because I think, and I talk to all my clients about exercise. Because these are things that can empower them and give them a common language for understanding not just how they're having difficulties, but how they can help themselves. Okay, so I talked about the corpus callosum. Now it's just a picture of where it is and how it's right in the center. This obviously is a side view. Okay. And it's interesting, that's the best picture of the cerebellum we've had so far. And you can see how it's part of the lower brain, but it's kind of mid-lower brain. Right? And there's the thalamus in the middle that I was I'll get this by the time it's over. The thalamus, and there's something called the insula, which is around there also, which is very important for this. And there's also something called the anterior cingulate. I don't want to throw a lot of Greek or Latin words at you, but they are, you'll read studies of work with, for example, OCD, and it'll involve the anterior cingulate. So we'll talk a little bit about that later when we get to it. I spoke about that, antidepressants in the hippocampus, right? Let me just see how we're doing on time. Okay, good. Okay, so this frontal cortex, frontal lobe, the orbitofrontal lobe. The orbitofrontal cortex is the spot at which the cortex is closest to the limbic system. It's only 6 cells away. So it's a good opportunity for us to talk about mindfulness. Why? Because in the West, the idea that somebody can go up on a mountain and meditate and be able to slow their heartbeat down to the extent that they essentially can hibernate and survive in freezing weather without food for extended periods of time, to do things like that. Well, we could just take the one example of bring their heartbeat way down. That's thought to be a superhuman power, right? Way beyond conscious control. How can you explain something like that? That was previously our definition of what a mystical insight or a mystical capacity was. The ability to do something like that. To have a thought and have that happen. Right? But, remember what the orbitofrontal cortex is the center of. It's really the center of the attentional unit. And if you're meditating and you're focusing on developing your intentionality, you intend to think about one thing and you do think about that one thing. Whether it's your breath or a mantra, whatever it is. You're developing that capacity. Okay, so you're developing that capacity. Who's going to know you're developing that capacity? Is it like a prison where every day you meditate, you can put a thing on the wall, and after a year or two, somebody can come in and see all this stick lines on your wall? I mean, silly. Of course not. Silly in a way, but actually, functionality changes structure. And the functionality of paying attention to one thing at a time and demonstrating control over your attention develops the tissue, those 6 cells. Whereas that connection point is a very thin strand in the average person. Somebody who's meditating many hours a day, it becomes a very thick strand. It becomes much more powerful. And more than anything else, it is directed from the orbital frontal cortex to the limbic system. Now, most of the connection points go from the limbic system to the cortex. And when you think of that in a structural way, that's the reason, that's one explanation for why emotion trumps thinking. Because the power of the middle brain exudes out to the neocortex. It reaches all the points. The cortex has very few points of contact going back the other way. This is one of them. With the meditator, like I said, the structure changes. And that's why they're able to do certain things. It's like you don't really question if somebody goes to the gym every day and they do a weight routine and they have incredible biceps. You don't say to yourself, wow, how did you do that? Right? It makes sense. It's again physical versus psychological. But if somebody trains their attention and they're able to bring their heartbeat down, we in the West say, wow, how did you do that? Like, you were just sitting thinking about something? Like, well, what were you doing? Well, I was thinking about something. What do you mean thinking about something? Right? That's a Western attitude. Okay? So thought counts. Thought involves movement. Thought involves the generation of cells and the change in function and changes in functionality. Okay? So when if you have things that you say to yourself, this goes back to, cognitive therapy, self-talk. If you have things that you say to yourself that calm you down, they send a message from your frontal cortex to your limbic system. And that can be very powerful. But you can't underestimate the power going the other way. And it can be very discouraging if you're just starting to rev up energy that goes from your conscious, intentional force to your limbic system so that you have more control, and then it becomes quickly overwhelmed. Like if you're in recovery and you're really trying to take one day at a time and you slip, it can be very discouraging, right? And you can feel like, well, that other process just doesn't work. But that's the nature of the process, that there will be slips. Because those other ways of processing emotion and even thinking about emotion are so ingrained. Okay, I jumped into this right away. So unless you have any questions about it, I'll just move to the next one. Hypofrontality. It's a great term because it shows you, you can talk about the frontal cortex and there's lots of different subdivisions. But the whole thing is united in the sense that it's where attention gets focused and you're able to prioritize what your thinking and feeling is about. Where you can think about your thinking, when you can observe what you're feeling. Okay, James walks into your office, sits down, begins to cry uncontrollably. What part of his brain is most likely controlling his behavior? Emotional, right, okay, excellent. James' mother accompanies him. She explains that he's been through a lot. She makes frequent eye contact with you and seems to notice when you're listening. And when she needs to slow down her presentation of the facts so that you have a chance to digest what she's saying. What portion of her brain is likely online? Frontal cortex, right? Why is James sad? His sister Lois was involved in a serious automobile accident. She can barely breathe for herself. She no longer is able to hear, see, speak. Her heart beats regularly and other vital signs are steady. What part of her brain function would you think is intact? Somebody say STEM? Did I hear that? Yeah, okay, good. Okay. Okay, psychoeducation medication. This is based on a case where I was working with a woman who was extremely depressed and had been traumatized by the onset of MS. She was in a wheelchair. Her husband was her son had been involved with drugs and was away at a treatment center, and it was wrecking their finances. And she was in my office with her husband. She was blaming her husband for the fact that the marriage was falling apart. And also that she couldn't let go of the fact that she had to fight him every inch of the way in order for him to release the funds so that the daughter could get the treatment that she needed. And so she was crying 5 hours a day, 6 hours a day. And she wouldn't take medication. There's different approaches. Like self-psychology is like one of my go-to approaches. Totally based on empathy. Totally based on tuning into the client's experience near consciousness. Experience near is what is near to them, what they are thinking about. In other words, not disturbing their point of view with something they're not thinking of. So staying right with them. And that's something I use a lot. But with her, it just made her go deeper and deeper into depression because she felt, well, nobody can really understand how it is for me. It doesn't matter what you're saying, or it's nice you're saying that, but that doesn't matter. Okay, then I started explaining to her about how trauma causes hypervigilance and how she had been exposed to these traumas and could no longer process any information about her husband or family without becoming activated. So she's driving in fifth gear all the time, no matter what, even when she's trying to park. Right? So, for some reason, who can explain what works in therapy? This made a big impression on her. And she decided to try medication, which helped her. Again, it's sometimes neuroscience, sometimes explanations of how the brain works can normalize a person's view of what's going on with them, especially if they think it's so pathological it can't be understood. Like, if you understood my brain, you'd still understand why I don't understand my brain. Because it's not. It can't be understood. That's what you want to see if you can do any unpacking of that and repackaging it in a way that feels more hopeful. Because what is it? A therapist, not all the time and not in every way, but to a major degree, is something Richard Schwartz, who is the founder of IFS, Internal Family Systems. He calls himself a hope peddler. A therapist is a hope peddler, right? You want to, and in other words, you want to give clients a sense of possibility. So here's I went through the description of the process of empathy, but I didn't talk about mirror neurons. And mirror neurons, they're the cells, they're very specialized cells, and they read this information. They look different than other cells, and they're only located in this particular part of the brain. And I believe it's the insula. Okay, and the story, I'll tell you, this is the mythology. There's a few neuroscience stories that get repeated again and again. This is one of them. There was a lab in Italy. The monkeys were wired up for the experiment. The researcher took a break. He came back, and before he engaged in the experiment, he put on his own EKG stuff, and he was still licking a gelato. And he could see his brain profile, his activity profile, as a gelato ice cream, right? And he could see his profile of activation and the monkey's profile of activation were identical. So the monkey was reading what he was doing by creating the internal experience through association. I mean, it was exquisitely similar. And that started this research to understand how can that be done. How do two brains sync up that way? What's involved? And this is maybe 20 years ago. Before that, this was not a term, it wasn't a concept. It was a thought. The thought was empathy is something we can never understand neurologically. We can explain what it looks like from the outside, but we don't know what happens on the inside. The new technologies change that. We can actually see what lights up, what patterns light up. So there's a theory that the mirror neurons underfunction in autism or are damaged. It's not completely verified, but it's not disproved. And that's why a lot of this stuff is really in flux. I mean, there's a lot that's been learned, but there's a lot that remains to be proved. That the research is promising in the sense that it's promising we'll know a lot more in the near future. Okay, so I'm going to take a second because that picture is a great picture, right? And I want to tell you what about. Okay, well, and maybe this will be the last thing I do. I'm sorry I didn't get to everything. But interpersonal neurobiology. In what sense is it interpersonal? Okay, biology we think of as people develop because of certain genes, and in interpersonal neurobiology, the emphasis is on the ways in which we develop as a result of exposure to interpersonal factors. So let me just describe that in terms of vision, by analogy. If a child is born with normal visual potential, the apparatus is all set. As soon as the light shines and is received by the optic nerve, it stimulates a whole set of reactions, and the occipital lobe starts to differentiate and develop in ways that eventually lead to the categorization and understanding of what's being seen. If a child is deprived of light for too long, normal vision will never develop. Right? Okay. If a child is born with normal capacity for empathy and relatedness, but doesn't have these kind of moments where they're able to see that somebody else sees them, and to see and understand that what they do means something to somebody else. If they don't have that input, just like if the child doesn't have a light, they don't have that input, they won't develop that capacity. I mean, love is a very complicated thing. It has romantic overtones, sure, but it also, it has a developmental energy. And I don't know what else to call it but love. Attention, concern, whatever we call love, that piece of it has to be demonstrated. It's not going to light up inside the other person if it's never been experienced one-to-one. And that's why a lot of the couples therapy, like EFT, emotionally focused couples therapy, they stress face-to-face contact as being neurologically powerful. Yes, interpersonally powerful, emotionally powerful, but neurologically powerful as well. We are geared to understand and take in that important messages from one person to another. Go face to face. Okay? Sorry we don't have more time. Thank you very much.